There was a hidden message in this recent season 5 scene from The Chosen. The cup on the table in front of Jesus is more than just an ordinary cup, more than just a vessel for Jesus' wine at the Last Supper, more than a holy grail that people have searched for centuries. This cup has a history, and it will not only explain what Jesus says in this Last Supper, it will explain something very important his disciples will do after he's gone. Want to know what it is? Well, then join me for this special episode of The Chosen Explained. Now, before we move on, if you love learning insights about The Chosen and want to see connections between the show and the Bible that will transform the way you watch it, then click the link above and down in the description and download my free resource called 7 Biblical Secrets Hidden in The Chosen. This will show you connections to Scripture and the first century world of Jesus that are present in the show, but most people don't notice. It's pretty powerful. We've packed a whole lot of information into a really small package, just like in this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. In order to understand why this cup is so important, we first have to understand exactly when this moment of Jesus' Last Supper takes place, because it's a huge clue into the importance of this cup. Luke's gospel tells us, "Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." And what Luke is describing here is an overlap of 2 Jewish celebrations, Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Passover was the time spent remembering the last of the 10 plagues in Exodus, in which God passed over the homes of the Hebrew people who had blood upon their doorframes, while taking the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh. It was this moment that forced Pharaoh's hand and caused him to free the Israelite people from slavery. Now, the Festival of Unleavened Bread, however, was different. This was the celebration of how the Israelite people prepared for their freedom. God told them not to put any yeast in their bread as they departed Egypt. They needed to leave quickly, and there was no time to let the bread rise. According to the Jewish calendar, as soon as Passover ended, the Festival of Unleavened Bread began. Well, according to Luke, the Last Supper between Jesus and his disciples happens at the transition point between Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. The Passover lamb is sacrificed on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, and then it's eaten after sunset, which marks the beginning of the 15th day of Nisan, the first day of the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Now, while those might seem like confusing details, they actually really matter when we're trying to understand what Jesus is doing in this scene. Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread are the lens through which the disciples see everything that is unfolding before them. I mean, they're in the middle of these celebrations, these holidays, these holy Jewish days. They can't help but see things in light of this. And if we really want to understand what Jesus is saying to them, we have to do the same thing. We have to remember that Jesus and his disciples are sharing a Passover Seder together as he says all of this. They are recalling specific scriptures, eating specific foods, drinking wine, reciting certain prayers, and seeing the connections between all of these things. So when Luke tells us he took some bread and gave thanks to God for it, then he broke it in pieces and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And after the supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." When Luke tells us these things, we need to see these events through Jewish eyes. And when we do, some very specific things stand out. For instance, when Luke tells us that Jesus took bread, the bread that he's talking about is matzah, a bread made without yeast to remember how the Israelite people could not add yeast to their bread as they fled Egypt, what they're celebrating at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's also a reminder of the manna, the bread that God provided for them once they had left Egypt. When Jesus takes the cup, this is one of the 4 cups of wine served at Passover. It's a reminder of the blood that was shed by Pharaoh for generations and the blood of the lamb upon the doorpost that spared the Hebrew people and set them free. And this is part of why this cup matters so much that sits in front of Jesus. Because it's not just a Christian symbol of who Jesus is, it's also a memory of things past. And this really matters. You see, when Luke tells us that Jesus gave thanks over the bread, he's referring to the Jewish prayer called a hamotzi, a traditional prayer that blesses God for allowing bread to come forth from the earth. He would have also blessed the wine with a prayer called the kiddush, a prayer that praises God for the fruit of the vine. And this is a big deal. Because here's the thing, the hamotzi and the kiddush weren't just spoken at Passover. These were prayers that Jesus and his disciples would have prayed every week during their Shabbat meal. For them, bread and wine were a regular part of life. Bread and wine had always been used to remember the Lord. Bread was associated with sustenance, with how God has always provided for the people. Wine was associated with celebration, rejoicing in the blessings of the Lord. All of this is about remembering. As they consume each of these things, as they recite these prayers, they remember who God is and what God has done for them. And this is another reason that this cup matters so much. Because when Jesus says, eat this bread and remember me, when he says, drink this wine and remember me, he's not doing something new. He's telling them to do what they've always done and to realize that these items now have even more meaning. He's not asking them to forget. He's not saying these things should no longer cause you to remember the Passover and the wilderness. This is their story. Instead, he's saying these things should now also remind you of me, of what I'm about to do for you. This bread will remind you of my body, which will be broken for you. This wine will remind you of my blood that will be shed for you, just like the blood of the lamb at Passover. And just as we dine now on a lamb whose blood was shed yesterday, so too you dine with a lamb whose blood will be shed for you tomorrow. Remember these things, not as things that were, but as things that are. This is why I told you that you must eat my flesh and drink my blood so that you will remember. And I want us to be really careful with that word, remember, because it meant something different to Jesus and his disciples than it means to most of us. The act of remembrance on Passover wasn't a recollection of things that happened to some different, distant group of people a long time ago in the past. It was much more personal than that. This is why during the Passover Seder, the people don't say when they were slaves in Egypt. They say when we were slaves in Egypt. It's not history, it's memory. And just as you can recall your wedding day or the birth of your child as if it were yesterday, just as you can experience those feelings and those emotions all over again, just as you can be transported there in your memory and experience the past in the present, Jesus is saying, that's what I want you to do here. Remember me. For this is not an event of the past, but an experience in the present and a promise for the future. For I am with you always. And in that same vein, Jesus makes one other statement that ties everything together, something that his disciples interpreted much differently than we do, something that shows us why this cup is so incredibly important. When he takes the wine, he says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And that phrase, new covenant, really isn't all that new when he says it. Because when Jesus talks about this new covenant, he's actually referring to a past promise. He's referring to the prophet Jeremiah, who says, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And suddenly, everything Jesus has been saying all comes into focus. Jesus is saying, through me, you can experience this new covenant. Through me, things can be different than they were with your ancestors. Because through me, the word of the Lord will be upon your hearts. For no one has seen the Father except the one who is from God, and I am that one. I am the bread of life. I am the Word made flesh. Mine is the blood of the Lamb, and the only way to the Father is through me. This is why you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. For this new covenant can only be experienced through me. The law can only be upon your hearts if you have me. And so this is why you do these things I command you, so that you will always remember me, lest like your ancestors you someday forget, and you must never forget. Let me ask you, do you remember what Jesus has done for you? Not as a recollection of some past event, but as something that is real and present and eternal. Do you experience Jesus as the disciples experienced the Passover meal that night, not as history, but as memory? And if not, what needs to change? Well, in the comments below, I'd love to hear what you think. How has this lesson changed the way you see this scene? How has it changed the way you see the Last Supper? And how will it change the way you experience and celebrate communion? Let me know your thoughts. And while you're at it, if you haven't done so already, make sure to download my free book called 7 Biblical Secrets Hidden in the Chosen. There's a link up above and down in the description. And for another video like this one that will change the way you see the Chosen, just click this link right here. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.